All right. So I think we are good to go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ari Sniverson, and I'll be hosting today's topic. Before we get started, please just note that microphones are muted, but we welcome you to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we're going to do our best to answer the questions either during the webinar when we get to that portion or at the end of the discussion. We're going to devote a portion to answering all of the questions we get. So today's topic is specifically about the sharing of medical imaging with expert witnesses. And before I get any deeper into that, we're also going to have a poll that comes up here. So while I introduce the topic and our subject matter expert, you are going to see some questions in a poll that pop up, and that's going to help us learn a little bit more about you and your practice. So if you could answer some of those questions for us, we're going to get back to that shortly. Les today is joining us and we'll be demonstrating the process. So not only are you going to hear about the current practice of sharing medical imaging with experts, but you're actually going to see a demonstration of it done in Purview image, which I think will be profoundly helpful. And for introductions, Les is the managing director of Purview. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, a best-selling author, and has decades of health tech experience under his belt. And on top of all this, probably most relevant to our discussion today, Les is trained as a lawyer and is a member of the bar in multiple jurisdictions. So thanks for joining us, Les.
My pleasure, Ari.
Let's look at the polls here. Am I able to see our results before we bounce back? I don't know if I see them just yet. We can return to that. But yeah, to recap what we'll be discussing today, this is specifically about sharing medical imaging with expert witnesses. This is something we hear often from the legal clients that we work with. We hear that this is a bit of a convoluted process at times since we're dealing with many different systems, and this can take a while, it can cost a little bit, and there is a simpler way to do this, and that's what we're going to be diving into today. So maybe to start our discussion, here, we can talk a little bit about the types of files that these images are coming in on. So Les, when we talk about the types of medical imaging that we're looking at, we often hear these are coming in DICOM files. Would you mind explaining what exactly that means?
Sure. So let me compare and contrast it to what most people know about image files. So most of you have dealt with images in a digital fashion, usually in a JPEG or a TIFF or a PNG format. Those are what I would call two-dimensional files. They are like pictures, like photographs. The difference between those and DICOM has the opportunity or has the advantage of enabling another dimension. And that other dimension could be 3 dimensions. So it could be an entire view of a body, or it could be a time dimension, which would be something that would be used in something like an ultrasound. So you'd see a rhythm over time. It's kind of like when you were a kid and you had one of those little cartoon books and you flip through it with your thumb and you would see the individual images and they'd appear as if they were moving. That's exactly what DICOM is. So these are individual images ultimately, but they're concatenated together in some fashion, either dimensionally or time-wise, and it gives you a much richer view than just that individual two-dimensional picture.
All right, so it sounds like these are a little bit more in-depth than a typical static image. Sounds like there's a multitude of images here. It sounds like there's some specific tags and information that are embedded into the images. Is that right?
Yeah, so in addition to them being more than just a single picture, they're encoded with what we consider to be a DICOM tag. And a DICOM tag is a set of fields, set of digital fields that will actually be on every image in the DICOM, we call them studies. So in the DICOM studies, which is a group of images together, and those fields designate things like referring physician, patient name, patient ID, the time that when it was taken, the type of modality or the type of scanner that it was. There's a lot of information that's encoded in there. It actually helps you authenticate the images themselves. So it's embedded. It comes along with the image, and that's part of the DICOM format.
All right, so these are pretty rich pieces of data then. There's quite a bit involved here. Les, would you maybe mind explaining how we get these? So maybe what the current practice looks like of how law firms are acquiring these images?
Yeah. So for those of you who dealt with digital images, digital images are bigger than most text files that you deal with. Well, DICOM images could be 1,000 times or even bigger than that times that image itself. And depending upon how dense it is, the amount of pixels, if you will, the resolution of the image, these could be enormous. So a typical multi-dimensional, so something like a CT or an MR scan could be on average 200 megabytes large. So I say that because they're not easy to handle. 200 megabytes, despite the fact that we've come a long way with computers, takes quite a bit of storage space. So you typically would not be able to attach that to an email, for example. We'll talk about why you shouldn't do that anyway, but that's bigger than what an email will handle. So today, what generally happens is if you ask for a DICOM image, you will get it on a CD. Now, it's not the modern way of doing it, but that's what people, that's what they use today. They use a CD like you and I used to put music on years ago. But these hold something like a typical CD holds something like 700 megabytes. So you could put a couple of DICOM studies on this and then transport it by hand or by mailing it to somebody. So typically that's how it's gotten today. There are better ways to do it from an electronic point of view, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on today.
Okay, so big file sizes and a little bit more involved than a regular document, a regular image, and so generally we're going to have to work with CDs here. Les, my understanding is that there are a set of laws involved with what it takes to get these discs or these medical records that maybe differ between clients and third parties. Am I getting that right?
So I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to by the laws, but in the world of medical images, these are all subject to HIPAA. And HIPAA, most of you who are involved with medical litigation understand that that's effectively a privacy law, federal privacy law. So what that means is you have to be really careful about who gets a hold of and who gets access to this kind of data. That data is called PHI, or private health information, and that's regulated in lots of ways. And it's pretty there's pretty severe penalties if you screw it up and don't treat that confidentially.
Okay, that makes sense. Clearly, when we're dealing with private health information, there's going to be things that we have to be mindful of and reasons that we can't just send this regularly. As you alluded to, sending this over email can pose some risks as well.
Yeah. So the basic procedures that are described in HIPAA and the HIPAA regulations say that you must secure this information. It must always remain confidential. And for those of you who haven't figured it out already, standard email is not confidential. And when you attach something to standard email, it doesn't help it become confidential or secure. So that's not good. A CD itself, if you mail a CD to somebody and you happen to put the wrong address and it goes to the wrong party, that's effectively a HIPAA violation. In fact, there's a very famous case years ago where somebody left a batch of these CDs on their driveway and somebody came and stole it.
Wow.
And that is a HIPAA violation. So you've got to be really careful about what you do with this. And the interesting part about it, and I think at least for the attorneys that I've worked with, most don't realize they are considered business associates for purposes of HIPAA when they handle medical records, if you will, and that includes these images from a patient or from a provider. And as a business associate, you've got lots of responsibilities, including the duty to train your staff as well as to maintain the information in confidential fashion. And probably even beyond that, which again, most of the attorneys that I work with don't realize, is if you store this information, if you store it in something like Dropbox or Google Drive or something that actually is on the internet, if that is not designated as HIPAA compliant, then you're responsible for the fact that you are now storing it in an environment that is not secure. And so that in and of itself could, well, it isn't a HIPAA violation for not doing it. It's a HIPAA violation if somebody then is able to get at that information. And when we talk to lawyers, we find all the time that they do believe things like Dropbox or Google Drive is HIPAA compliant, and it very well may be. But in order to ensure that, as a good business associate, you have to have what we call a BAA, or a business associate agreement. And if you don't have a business associate agreement, specifically with Dropbox or with Google, and they're not so easy to get, by the way, they're available, but they're not so easy to get, then the storage that you have is not HIPAA compliant. So it's a bit of a mess, a bit of a morass of laws that we have to deal with. And as attorneys, although that's our job, is to understand those laws, we typically don't really, or at least the ones I've talked to, don't really understand all of the nuances of what's required of them.
Sure. And I think that brings up a good point that we should make sure to get back to, which is storage in general and how that works. Maybe before we do that, I'm seeing some of these poll results come in. We can take a look at this, and thank you everyone for answering. It looks like in response to the first question, we were asking about how many people are using DICOM medical images during litigation in any way, and the majority of people do use them who answered this poll. It looks like as far as using them during litigation, where it's stored, it's pretty split. And we're about to talk about this in a second here, between using local servers and using some form of shared cloud file storage, like you mentioned, Dropbox, Google Drive, Box. And then finally, we asked about how many people are entering DICOM images into evidence. And it looks like the majority, by a little bit, said that they're not. So this is also an interesting distinction that maybe we can spend some time on, but there is a difference between using this in trial and using this during discovery and pre-trial. So maybe we can get to that too. But Les, if you want to get into what you were just mentioning, storage, how does that currently work? And what are some of the ways that law firms can store these medical images?
Yeah. So many people, and I see the poll answered split between cloud and local computer drive. Many people store medical images right on drives, whether they be cloud or otherwise. And that's great, assuming that it's secure, as we just talked about. But one of the problems is that DICOM is not like a picture. You can't just see it. You actually have to have a DICOM viewer in order to see it. And oftentimes when people store it in a file format, which is the way it comes on a CD, it's not accessible to that viewer. It has to be stored to be accessible to a viewer. Typically, not always, but typically it has to be stored in something called a PACS. That's a PACS, a picture archive and communication system. And a PACS is a purpose-built environment for the storage of DICOM. And that could be local, that could be right on your machine, or that could be cloud-based, depending upon what you select.
All right, so there's a few levels here. There's maybe at the most basic level, there's some physical storage that could be involved. And while no one specifically admitted to this, I'm sure there are firms out there that are keeping CDs and DVDs in literal shoeboxes or file cabinets. Maybe a level up from that, we saw some people answering storage on their local server. And then up from that, what you were just discussing was Google Drive, Dropbox, these shared cloud storage systems, which could maybe or maybe not be HIPAA compliant. And this kind of gets back to what you were discussing before about being a business associate. So how does that play into this? And what do law firms have to keep in mind when they're thinking about where to store their images?
Yeah, so you mentioned the term shoebox. I talk about that all the time. In fact, that's the predominant way that I've seen most lawyers store their medical images. They get them on CDs, they store them on CDs, and when they need to transfer them to somebody else, they make a copy of the CD and they put it in the mail or a courier and send it to them. And that's okay. Again, assuming it's sufficiently secure. Just painful and time consuming and expensive. Right? I don't know if any of you recall, again, making copies, illicit or not, of the music that you had in the 80s and 90s. You made it on CDs, and to copy a CD is not an instantaneous task, right? It takes time. It takes, I don't know, depending on the volume of the CD, what's on there, it could take 15 minutes to sit there and watch something be copied. Kind of a waste of time, an expensive waste of time from that point of view. Second, it also is very error prone. So when you talk about media like this magnetic media, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes when it gets mailed, it gets crushed, broken, and sometimes it gets lost. So not the greatest way to do it all the time, but you could do it that way. the other ways to do it, the other ways to store it, are to store it in, as I said, in something like a DICOM format, and that's purpose built. And if you do it right, or you have the right one, and I can show you one that I've got here on my desk, or if that makes any sense to you, when you store it in a DICOM file and you have the right kind of system, you can share it securely right from the file itself. So right on your computer, without having to make a copy of the CD, without having to mail it, without having to pay a courier, without having to do any of that stuff. That's really the most facile way to do it. And it's not rocket science. It is something that's done all the time. Although I can tell you that even the medical profession uses CDs more than they use electronic means for transfer today.
Sure. Yeah, and that could be helpful to take a look at this. It sounds like obviously having to store private health information in any manner is going to be tricky, and there has to be, like you said, a purpose-built system for this. Could you maybe touch on what the sharing aspect of this looks like when we're directly sharing with expert witnesses? And if you're open to it, maybe show us what the alternative to that is.
Yeah, let me do a couple things really quickly. I know you didn't ask, but it's my passion. So I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind, and I'll show you a few things. So one, I'd like to show you what a DICOM image might look like, because that's pretty cool in and of itself. So what you're seeing right now is effectively the work list on my system. So my work list is made up of all of the DICOM studies that I have in this particular case in my cloud. And there's lots of them here. This is a demo system, so these are all de-identified, but there's lots of them here that I have. And to get at them, I can look for them. I can search by name. I can do all kinds of wonderful things. In this case, this is the one that I want to get to, so I'm going to jump to this one here. So just to give you a flavor before I get started with answering your question about sharing, let me show you what one looks like. So here's a DICOM image. Now notice I'm moving my mouse as I do this, but you notice this is changing as I'm moving, and that's because I'm going through different layers. This is a CT, I believe. Actually, it's an MR. I'm going through different layers of the scan that occurred. So these scans, think of them as different planes of the anatomy. But even cooler than that, and this is mostly good for things when you want to explain it to a jury, is you can do something with an MR or something like that, and you can see it's it is a, I don't know, kind of a wild image. This is of a live person. So this is an MR, full body MR of a person. I can show you what the person looks like. I don't want to divulge any bad things, but there you go. So that's a real live person. And if there's an anomaly in the anatomy that you've got here that you want to show to a jury, this would be the greatest way to do it. We talk about a picture being worth 1,000 words. Well, in my world, a DICOM image is worth 1,000 pictures, or maybe more than that in this case. I think it is more than 1,000 pictures. So this is really interesting, cool, etc. On the left, just so you know, is something called multiplanar reconstruction. So these are the three planes that you can look at separately, and they are all aligned. So as I move these lines, you can see I move in different directions through the anatomy. We're not doctors, or I'm not a doctor at least. So I would say there's more to this than what I can describe to you, but pretty darn cool from that point of view and very useful. But back to the work list for a minute. To share a study, it's I can do it really, really simply. So I'm going to not allow any of the stuff I'm going to do. I'm going to type in your email address. Perfect. Now, interestingly enough, I said before that you shouldn't attach an image to email because it's not secure. This is actually a secure email. It's going to send a note to Ari, and it's actually not going to send the PHI in the note. It's going to say, hey, Ari, you now have control to look at this same image that I'm looking at. So I'm going to send that to you. And this is a de-identified image, so you don't have to worry about PHI in this particular case. But what's going to happen is this is going to show up on your, I don't know, do you have your cell phone handy?
I do. Let's see. Let's pull this open.
So look at it on your cell phone, and I'll switch back to where I was just a minute ago. That come in?
Maybe taking a little bit here. Let's see.
There's some delay in my send, but that's okay.
We're streaming.
I'll keep going through this while that's getting to you. But in any case, this is an opportunity for you to see exactly what I have on my screen. So I've given you the rights to do that. So let's say that you're sharing this with your expert witness. Your expert witness has a medical grade viewer on his or her desktop that he can analyze the image and come back to you with the, hey, this is what's right or this is what's wrong. We don't need to go into it in this particular demonstration, but if I clicked on this little, what I call two-headed monster, actually you and I could be looking at the same image synchronously. And that would be, and then I could describe to you kind of like what you should be describing to the jury if you get there. And in most cases, I think our audience has said that as well, is they don't typically end up with DICOM being presented in evidence. And we can talk about how you would do that. But it is, if you were to present it in evidence in a trial, it'd be great to have all of the words of your expert witness right in your head when you did that. So we can do that with this two-headed monster here that we've got. So that share is really simple, really to the point. But in addition to that, I can also, as an expert, I can generate a report for you. So I don't have to just describe it to you face to face. So one, I've been able to share the study immediately, even though it's big. And this one's really big. This is probably 500 megabytes large. And it instantly gets sent and it instantly gets viewed. Again, no postage required. But here I can, as an expert, you can see I've got my own little headline here. I think Samantha set this up for me. Trackman medical experts, we're not, by the way, but you can have it here. I can create this report for you. And when I finish the report, I can send that report to you. So I can email it right to you, just like I did before. I won't try that now because I apparently have bogged up my email, but I can send that report to you as well. In fact, when I sent you the image, if the report had been created before, I could send you both at the same time. So as an expert, I can send back to you, Ari, an expert report. You can then read it and understand exactly what I'm thinking and seeing and what my analysis is for your trial that's coming up next week.
Great. Okay. So it sounds like this is streamlining a lot of the communication between law firms and their experts, potentially opposing counsel, clients. It sounds like a lot of that is streamlined and not just a way that makes it faster, but a little bit more secure.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about it, it's cloud-based. So if you're a law firm that's distributed, has multiple offices, multiple locations, or you have some lawyers working distributed at home, everybody can access this simultaneously, same time. They can get access from anywhere on any device. That's what the cloud is good for. Again, you could do this on your desktop as well, but once it's on your desktop, it's much harder to share. Great place to store, great place to view, a little bit harder to share.
Great. Well, I've got a few questions about some of what you went over, but first, just for the audience, if you'd like, you can please put some questions in that have come into your mind as we're talking about sharing, storage, viewing. We've got a Q&A section here. You can just go in there and leave your questions and we'll get to those as soon as we can. But Les, I would love to hear a little bit more about, you mentioned a lot of the sharing capacity within Purview Image itself. With the legal clients that I talk to, and I imagine with the ones you talk to, I very often hear that they have a CMS or a case management system in place and that maybe this is able to handle some of what we discuss. Is that the case or is that missing anything?
Yeah. So what I would say is just what I showed you on the screen, that typically is not a part of any case management system that I've seen. So there are some case management systems that do have, I would call them rudimentary DICOM viewers that are in there, but they weren't set up that way. They weren't set up to be this specialized database, if you will, to house these. So in fact, what you've got is you've got a separate DICOM storage, and the best systems are ones that integrate the two. So from the case record that's in your case management system, you can literally click a button and invoke the viewer and get to see the image that's part of your file. Now, again, I'll throw the caveat out there. If you do that, if you do medical litigation and you've got a case management system, be sure that that case management system is HIPAA compliant. And if it is, get that BAA from the vendor. The fact that they say they're HIPAA compliant is not sufficient for you as an attorney. You must get that BAA letter that gives you the confirmation that in fact that vendor is going to maintain the information in a HIPAA compliant manner.
Great. And maybe short of HIPAA compliance, making sure that there is a BAA on file, is there anything else that our listeners should be aware of or should consider when choosing a vendor or choosing a system that they can share from?
Um, well, there's a few things that do come up from time to time, and one is that the experts that you engage, typically are medically trained. Most of them are medical doctors, maybe even deep level subspecialists in the area that you're trying to portray in your litigation or in your discovery discussions. And what they want is they want the ability to view something in a medical grade kind of viewer. So there are lots of viewers out there, some of which are fantastic from a medical grade point of view, and some of which are not so good. So um, a lot of people call them FDA approved for primary diagnosis viewers, and that's really the kind that you'd like to have. And again, they can get that on their desktop, or they can get that in a cloud-based environment. The software that I showed you, if the expert wants to, they can download it securely right to their own viewer, which would probably be a desktop viewer at that time, and manipulate it, view it, come up with the conclusions, and then put the report right in here. So there's a lot of flexibility that are built into these, but you want something that's good. You want something that's not just a toy. You want something that your expert can really rely on.
Great. And when you mention manipulation, maybe this is another area to dive into. When law firms are consulting with their medical experts, and maybe the expert wants to show them something very precise, a certain measurement, a certain detail, uh, anything related to the image that's a little bit more than they can just explain. Is there the ability to annotate and mark these images up?
There are on most viewers. So in most viewers, you can write on it's actually an overlay. So you're not impacting the authenticity of the images themselves. But there's an overlay which you can do ROI, regions of interest. You can measure tumors. You can put pointers. You can put text annotation so that it makes the image come alive. The one thing that lawyers are very concerned with, and they should be, is that you don't want to change the image because that ruins the authenticity of it. If in fact you need to bring it into trial and offer into evidence, you want it to be, as we like to say, the best evidence. You want it to be something that hasn't been tainted by any changes that have been made. So it comes right from the doctor.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in here just yet, but Les, do you have any other closing remarks or anything that you want to mention about what we've spoken about that maybe we can leave the listeners with moving forward?
There's a ton of stuff. So I would start out by saying that these systems have to be simple enough for you to use. So what I've shown you today is underneath the covers, it's a very complex piece of software. It's taken years and years to develop, but it's built so that anybody, as I like to say, any idiot, which includes me, can use it and actually make sense of it. And so that's what you want to make sure you've got, something that is usable by you, by your paralegals, by others in your organization. Two, you want to make sure that it can accept these dreaded CDs, because that is likely going to be the way that you get those first images from the providers that you requested from. So you're gonna probably have to upload the CDs. So make sure your system can upload the CDs. And then the last piece that I would caveat you on, and it's not really related to the software, but it is related to how we deal with these images, is when you go to obtain these images, as Ari said in his opening remarks, sometimes these providers or their third parties that they hire, called ROIs, recovery of information, sometimes they charge lawyers a lot of money. And it turns out that although the federal laws were written in such a way that that shouldn't have happened, there was a pretty well-known lawsuit that was raised I think it was in 2020, by one of the big ROI vendors, a vendor called Ciox, who sued the federal government and actually won, and said the federal government could not restrict the fees that these organizations charge to lawyers. So when you go to get these images, although they are relatively inexpensive or free to a patient by federal law, to you, they may charge you tens or hundreds of dollars to get those, and they can by law. So the way that we suggest, and this does come back to software in just a minute, but the ways that we suggest that you get around that, if that's important to you, which in many cases it could be, is to have your patient make the request for the records and provide your patient with a very simple way for them to upload it to your system. And that happens to be built into the software that I showed you today, but something that's really, really simple for the patient so that they can obtain the records, they can upload them to you, and you can put them in your system, and nobody has to pay those tens or thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars that these ROI vendors charge you. So, I mean, that's up to you. If speed and your handling it is of the utmost importance, then go ahead and pay those fees. But you can get around them by having your patients do it, which is something that we encourage patients to do.
Sure. It's about keeping it foolproof for all parties involved, making this a simple process. I can imagine there's so many areas where this could go wrong, so it's about simplifying those. It looks like we do have a question from the audience, so maybe we can address this one. Corinne asks, how often would you use Medical Illustrator to make an artistic interpretation of the DICOM slices, and how do you feel this impacts the authenticity of the strategy for trial?
Yeah. So despite the fact that I am an attorney, I don't do trials for a living. So I can't give you the tried and true of what I've done and say that's my experience. But I can tell you that if you can get an image that's as vibrant as what I just showed you, that body in the MRI, then you don't need an illustrator to do that. You can actually export that image and use that in living color, as I like to say, in your trial. You also, in many cases, can use a computer screen in a trial to show right from a DICOM kind of environment like this. I mean, you've got to have internet connection, but that's reasonably common in most courtrooms these days. So I would say that as we move forward with this computer technology, there'll be less of a need for a specific medical illustrator, but medical illustrators do magic. I mean, they can make these images really come to life. And that's when you're explaining something to a jury, it's really important to make it simple and obvious to them. And medical illustrators do that.
Okay. Very helpful. Another question we have, and this is on the other side of the equation, was can my expert witness leave notes or annotation? Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is, it was actually, can I share with more than one expert at a time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is yeah. And this we see a lot, right? So we're not necessarily shopping for an expert witness opinion, but you may want to share, if it's an important case, you may want to share this evidence with multiple experts and see which one has the best perspective on the evidence at hand. And so you may want to share it with multiple experts, and you can do that at the same time. The share that I showed you before, you can actually, even if it's a medical expert that you work with all the time, you can actually give them access to your system. So there's lots of ways to do that. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about is anonymizing or de-identifying the image before you share. So one, it's always a good practice to de-identify an image. You don't want to change the DICOM. So you're likely going to make a copy of the image and de-identify a separate copy of that. So de-identifying means getting rid of all the PHI so that's not obvious. And then when you share it with an expert, they're not tainted by is it a man, is it a woman? I guess they could see if it's the right part of the anatomy, but who is this person? They won't know this, so they won't be tainted by that, and they give you a more objective opinion. And of course, if for some reason that image gets in the wrong hands, de-identified means it's not a HIPAA violation. So you can do that as well, and that's something that we've seen in many of the systems that we're talking about today.
Great. And I can imagine that's something where if you're not working with a system like this or some sort of uniform viewer, your support staff could be working with disparate systems that were sent from the provider, and it might be hard to de-identify some of this information. So
some of it is really hard to de-identify. So you want to just rely on it being secure, just in case there is PHI, and sometimes it could be hidden in these files. But yeah, that's a part of what we do. So making it really simple for the sharing, for the expert, for opposing counsel, for other attorneys in your office to use, maybe your medical illustrator to get a hold of. That's really important. Doing that without the delays and the costs and the treachery of having to make these CD copies is always a good idea as well. And we're in the 21st century now. The idea of these CDs being the delivery mechanism. I mean, as you might tell from my gray hair, I've been around a long time, and the way we used to deal with computer networks was we used to call it sneaker net, where you take a disk from one machine to another, and that's how you'd communicate. That's what CDs are today. They happen to be optical, so they're a little bit higher technology than what we used, but it's the same thing. It's the same mundane process of carrying a piece of data from one place to another. Again, not the best, most efficient or cost-effective way to do it, but it is part of what we do. And so once we get those CDs, we try to make sure that we never have to use them again.
Right. Absolutely. Well, this has been super productive. And to conclude some of this, we started talking a little bit about what DICOM images really are, why they're different than static images, and why we have to handle them a little differently. We went through some of the process of acquiring these medical records, storing them, and then, of course, took a deep dive into sharing them. So I think this has been very productive. We can maybe pop some resources up on the screen moving forward. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And this is a very timely and important discussion when it comes to dealing with experts and how to streamline some of these processes. But if you want any further information about handling medical images specific to litigation, we have that up on the website. It's purview.net. You'll see some more resources listed here, including a checklist for law firms that they can go through, make sure that everything is up to snuff. And an email here, you can reach out to us with any questions that you have, and we're happy to answer. But thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Ari.